Alright, so this is one we kind of talked about for a while, where we're going into the four movies that featured one of the most famous, obviously, Hollywood couples in on both the screen and in real life with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and they only did these four and really, really close together, like almost consecutive years. 45, I think, was the only year that was left out, which, interestingly enough, is when the pre-release print of The Big Sleep was released, so really kind of fills in all the gaps. But to my understanding, they were seeking out possibly a fifth one much later, but then his death eventually prevented that. So we do have these four, and they are a pretty definitive group of four. Like, there's not a weak link among them, so that's really interesting. But it's sort of their approach to, I guess, different filmmaking styles in general, is also what makes them feel so varied. Because you have the Howard Hawks movies, which you can kind of group together, and we kind of will when we talk about them. Whereas when we talk about Dark Passage and Key Largo, it's going to be a little more individual. Which Dark Passage and Key Largo you can get a couple of ways. There is the Turner Classic Movies DVD that has all four of these in it, but then Bacall also had her own, which has those other two in it, as well as Blood Alley with John Wayne and Designing Woman with Gregory Peck. So we are going to be talking about these two specifically, but I do want to start over here, kind of just going in their chronological order, their order of release, I guess you could say. And it's worth noting when you look at the Howard Hawks ones, To Have and Have Not, and The Big Sleep, it could get a bit frustrating talking about them, especially on a platform as public as YouTube, because despite what, people who are under the impression they know literally every detail of everything, especially in YouTube comment sections and other places like that, there are a lot of things surrounding To Have and Have Not and The Big Sleep that are not definitive. Like, there is no absolute 100% interpretation of some of the things that came out of this. So we'll talk about what could possibly be true and what could possibly have been said and what some things in the movies could possibly mean. But as far as I know, it's always somebody has one outlook, some has another, and it all kind of got lost in history somewhere. Which is the fact that there's almost like a mythology around these two movies is immediately what puts some sort of greatness over them that the movies don't even have to worry about. History did it for them. So the thing about it, first of all, you can probably talk about is the pairing of Bogart and Bacall, which, especially nowadays, would probably seem really weird to people, perhaps, given the giant age difference. But the thing about that, for starters, is number one, they both kind of always looked like Bogart always seemed a bit older than he actually was. And I don't know if it was the way about him or the characters he played or just the whole that sort of I've seen everything face that he had. And like his characters, you immediately get the sense that they've been through so much before the movies even, like when he first walks in to the frame in like any of his movies, he always looks like he's seen like all of history as he comes in. But with with Bacall, it's kind of a similar thing where I don't know how many people even realize that she was 19 when To Have and Have Not came out, because there's this real maturity about her, like not just in her performance, but just the way she like carries herself and looks and everything. And you can tell there was like an immediacy to how they became like equals. I mean, like he'll call her like, kid occasionally, which he did in many movies, but in this case in particular, it may stand out if you're focused on that. Like I said, the chemistry was so immediate in their scenes, because it's really early in both of these movies when they have contact with each other. There's no particular build-up or anything. It just kind of felt like this instantaneous thing, which you can obviously get that sense with it, the real-life nature coming into it also. I think I read somewhere Bacall said it was like, they've been working on To Have and Have Not for maybe 3 weeks, when the chemistry started to become real, and then it just kind of went on from there. And it's one of those things also to where you think, typically romances like this in Hollywood never really lasted, and you would think this would definitely be one of those, but no, it's you could say the same thing about Tracy and Hepburn. They went all the way to his death, and so there's something that feels so definitive about their romance because of that, because it lasted till the end. That I think really adds a certain integrity to these movies that may not necessarily have stood the test of time if that wasn't the way it went down, but it is. So there's that. And talking about them being equals despite their age difference in this case, or where they were coming from, where she was also lacking experience because this was her very first movie, which, like I said, she walks in with seemingly so much experience, something you would never think would be the case. But that's also kind of a segue into what a lot of the themes of the movie are, particularly the whole sort of working together against a common enemy thing, where it's like the whole story revolves around the idea of not just everybody coming together and working together for this, but also the sort of making your own individual choices. Where it's like, particularly surrounding Bogart's character when it comes to him deciding to do this whole thing about bringing the people on the boat, because it's like, and it's also weird how much that really took off and how much people like to analyze that, because to my understanding, Hawks wasn't really interested in politics or putting politics in the movie, when it's one of like the massive themes, the whole anti-fascism thing. But the thing about that also is when, like I was talking about with the individual choices, where Bogart's character initially gets sort of almost backed into a corner for having to do this for money. But then there's the line where it's like, where he says it's because, I don't like them. And it becomes this common thing. But the way he makes that decision, because it starts off with this whole chain of events at the start, where he takes the guy out on the boat and they do the fishing and all that stuff, and then the guy owes him the money, but then the guy doesn't have the money and was actually going to run off to the airport before he could do that in the morning, and eventually it was going to be, oh, well, we have the traveler's check, so now I do have the money, and then he doesn't have the money when the guy gets killed. So it's this whole sort of chain of events that leads to he needs money, and that's going to be what drives this. But then there's that one line that he says, though, that's kind of like, it really takes it in this whole other direction. And then there's also the debate that they have where it's like, did he do it for her? And then it's like, there's so many different reasons that Morgan could potentially have done this job. And yeah, and that's kind of the thing also, is kind of debating which one of those really is the reason. But either way, it was his own individual choice, which is a really big player in this whole thing. So as far as the story itself goes, it is weird that it's based on what I guess most people, including Hemingway himself, claim to be the worst thing that he wrote, or his worst novel. So you have, who is it? It's William Faulkner, and also his co-writer on The Big Sleep also, Jules Furthman. And they sort of, and the whole thing about how Faulkner and Hemingway both had Nobel Prizes at the time, so it's like, it seemed like this whole sort of big, like, all the pieces were adding up that this was going to turn out to be, like, a masterpiece. But the interesting thing about that is how little the story seems to play in regards to what the movie is known for and what the movie is beloved for. Because you do have this whole thing where it had come like right after Casablanca, and a lot of people kind of saw it as like a kind of a Casablanca ripoff of sorts. Some people, and I guess you can kind of get that. There's many cases where that feels like reaching, but I can get like the vague sense of where people would get that idea from it for sure. But the fact is that the whole star of the movie, and this is something we'll go into with The Big Sleep also, is that the plots and all that and the story serve their own purpose, and they do work in themselves. Obviously, David and Not is significantly easier to follow story-wise, where you actually get the idea that they knew the story they wanted to tell. Even, deviating pretty far off of Hemingway's the source material. So, going on that, though, it is really kind of the star of the movie, the romance between the two of them, which, like I said, we'll talk about a lot with The Big Sleep also. where they have these moments where when she first comes in, like I said, when it's instantaneous, when she's leaning in the doorway and she asks for a match, and it's like, or the scene where she's at the piano and they do the song, or the whole whistling line. And there's something in itself even there in the whistling line where that in itself is considered like one of the most, famous quotes in movie history, because there is the sort of, double meaning or double entendre going there. But the thing about that also that stands out to me is another thing you'll notice when you sort of analyze the movie or read about the movie is the use of the nicknames, and how most of the characters in this movie go by some sort of nickname. And there's no this is one of those many debated things where it's like, where did the nicknames come from? Apparently, Slim for her actually came from Hawks's own wife and stuff like that. And there's a few things I've heard about where Steve came from, and it's like, the first thing I notice is you hear when she says, "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve?" It's the start of the line, and people know that that's one of the most famous lines in movie history, and it's like, that basically means there are probably a number of people out there, a large number of people out there that know this line that haven't seen the movie, and have this false idea of what Bogart's character's name is in the movie. Despite Harry Morgan being a famous character name in itself, that line just kind of gives that a whole other direction. But then there's also the whole thing about them, because obviously, like Frenchie and other characters like that, and Cricket, the piano player, have those nicknames like that. But specifically between these two characters, it is more of like it's almost like an instant familiarity, despite the fact that we see their first meeting. Like, once they start calling each other by these nicknames that, as far as the story goes, like within the story, make no sense to us or anybody else. It's like there's just automatically something between them that kind of goes into that rapport that makes that stand out. Like I said, we don't really even need to know where they come from, and that's, as long as they establish that, that's kind of the point. And like I said, as far as the plot not playing a huge part in how beloved it is it's like, the interesting thing that I notice is that chain of events I was talking about, where he's supposedly going to get his money from this dude, and then the dude gets killed before he can, and then there's the whole thing where they get taken off and interrogated and all that. I feel like everything that happens before the actual plot, before he actually starts off on the job that he needs to do, is the more intriguing aspects of the movie. Like, I like those scenes before it all takes off, when it actually is taking off and they're actually doing the thing. And there are so many great character moments, like especially the moment when they're being interrogated and she gets slapped in the face. And it catches us off guard, especially with how much of a stonewall she is when it happens. And then he actually goes back to this later, and it's basically the whole, where he basically says, that's the moment where I knew, like, oh, you weren't who exactly I thought you were, but that's good. Or that's better, I guess you could say. And yeah, and it is, and you can also tell where they, deviated from the novel, and they took, because even despite its writing credits really standing out, I'm under the impression that a lot of the dialogue was improvised. So there is, and obviously, you hear improvised, and there's a number of ways you can imagine that versus how it probably went, but it was likely written, it's just a matter of not exactly the way it was when they started. Like, for instance, the whistling line, I believe is Howard Hawks' line, and he wrote it as like, it was supposed to be like, it was basically her audition, just to see if she could have that sort of way, and then when she delivered it so well in her audition or screen test or whatever it was, he told Faulkner that he should put it in the script somewhere, and then Faulkner kind of shaped the scene around that line. So that's, to my understanding, what happened. So, and as far as that character work being so strong, and the chemistry between the two of them being such a strong factor in the movie, another thing that kind of proves this is the movie has been, I wouldn't say the movie's been remade a couple of times, but the book has been adapted a couple more times. And there was one, The Breaking Point, with John Garfield and Patricia Neal, I believe, which is fine by itself, but even if you haven't seen the movies, you know more about To Have and Have Not than you do about The Breaking Point, don't you? Like, you like, there's just something about its stance in history. And then there's another one called The Gun Runners that Don Siegel did, which, as talented of a director as Don Siegel is, was a movie that just kind of went off the map. So, it's pretty clear that even though it deviated so much from the novel, which, from the sounds of it, was for the better, being considered his worst novel, really paid off in this really big way. So, yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of gossip surrounding it about, like, how Hawks was potentially jealous of Bogart and Bacall because he also had a thing for Bacall, and maybe there's something a little underlying about the fact that she has his real-life wife's nickname in the movie, but then Bogart was the one that ultimately ended up with her. I don't know. That sounds a lot... I mean, it sounds plausible, but it also sounds an awful lot like regular Hollywood gossip that may or may not be bullshit. Especially since Hawks hired them again for this following movie with The Big Sleep, which, once again, there are so many things about The Big Sleep that are so not definitive that there are actual, like, records of saying that Hawks had conversations with Raymond Chandler, the author of the novel, and they had discussions about plot points in the story that Chandler doesn't even know. There's so much, like there's so much stuff in here that just kind of goes unexplained or really only serves the purpose to get us from point A to point B in the story. MacGuffins, as you could probably say. There is... Yeah, so going into that does kind of just come with the territory of, like, the noir genre, or the whodunit genre, even. And I know that there is apparently, weirdly enough, some debate about the idea of... Because when I think of the word noir, this is the very first movie I think of. Like, every time. Every time I hear the word, this movie is the first thing I see in my head. And I do get that there are, especially nowadays, the definition of noir has become pretty loose. And, like, some people throw the word at some movies, and I'll be like, what in the hell are you talking about? But I do also think there are some people that maybe have a bit too concise of a definition of it also, because apparently there are some people that will argue that Howard Hawks never made a noir movie, which is bizarre because this movie exists. And yeah, it doesn't have some of the stuff. It doesn't have, like, you know, Bogart voiceover, or it doesn't have, you know, like, you know, flashbacks and stuff like that. Stuff that you really see in, like, the definitive examples, but I still say this absolutely has to fit the bill. Just regardless of what your definition of it is, it's mostly all here. And that's the thing that's really dangerous about these movies now and how they hold up is, and some people may have no problem with this whatsoever, but sometimes I fear that noir is a genre that has been so parodied or so badly imitated, despite sincerity, that when you come back to the ones that are, like, in its true form, there's a question of how seriously they can still be taken. Because there's just... surely you know what I mean by that. But the thing is the thing that really keeps this one, I think, alive in a number of ways is, first off, just like we talked about with Have and Have Not, the chemistry between the two. Absolutely. Especially since there were those... there's a difference between the version that came before it, that is featured on this DVD, that's a couple of minutes longer, despite the fact that there was stuff taken out, but also stuff put in, and it's kind of more linear, and it kind of tries to make more sense of itself. But we lost a lot of Bacall to that too, and you can really see where, like, the magic of it was kind of lost. Like one of the when you look at the dialogue in this, once again, it's just been so parodied to death or badly imitated, it may come off as a bit much. But like, when you put it in your mind that this was, like, the crowning example, then it kind of comes together pretty easily. Like, when you look at how dialogue heavy it is and some of their specific lines that people still talk about, like, the first time he meets, I think Carmen is the other daughter's name, and he says the line, she tried to sit on my lap while I was standing up. And what's interesting about that line and why it works so well is that we see the moment he's talking about happen shortly before he says that line. We see her try to sit in his lap while he's standing up. But that's the thing is nobody talks about the moment. Like, nobody talks about the moment we actually see of that. Everybody only relates it through Bogart's line and just quoting that line. And that's how that scene stands the test of time. Not because of the scene itself, but just the one line Bogart says that's relaying it back to the general that's hired him. So I think that in itself says a lot about the dialogue. And then, of course, there's a number of lines where it's like, they said that in 1946? Like, they could get away with that? Where there's stuff like, when the driver takes him to the door and he says, if she says, if you can use me again, contact me at this number. And he says day or night, and she says, well, I work during the day, so night is the best. And it's like, but then that seems really mild when you hear the very, very famous horse conversation that ends with Bacall saying, it depends on who's in the saddle. And it's those moments where it's like, there's definitely an innocent layer on top of it, where it sounds like a normal conversation about horses and all that. But then, like I said, when you have come to terms with taking everything, like even going back to To Have and Have Not, if To Have and Have Not gets you used to looking at all the underlying meanings of pretty much every line they say to each other, you hear the horse line and it's just like, whoa, I can't believe they said that in 1946. I didn't even know they spoke like that in 1946, come to think of it. But yeah, so there's that, but there's also kind of the cast of characters also, where even though it can get very confusing with all these characters coming in and out, and all these characters you think might be important, then maybe or maybe they aren't. Dorothy Malone was always one of my favorite moments in this, when he has his interaction with her. But then there's stuff where like all the characters come together, where like all the characters very early in the movie, like maybe 45 minutes in, like so many of the characters converge in one room. And of course, when you look at the chapter titles on this DVD, the title of that chapter is Everybody Comes to Brody's, which of course is a sort of funny reference to Casablanca. But then it's actually right around that time where everybody converges and, Brody ends up getting killed and stuff like that, that the plot kind of starts to take off in these directions where you just kind of don't know what the hell's going on. And Chandler, who wrote it, didn't either. So, but that's kind of what I think a lot of the appeal of it is that whole, like, not only does it just feel like this almost unsolvable mystery until you just watch it all play out, because that was a problem I had a lot with if you want to talk about, like, the whodunit genre specifically. That was a genre that, when I was younger, like, always really annoyed me, because there was always the thing about... Because everybody that watches a whodunit wants to solve them. They want to put the pieces together themselves and figure it out before the detective stands in the middle of the room and explains everything. But it always seemed like so convoluted, where it was like, where the detective would say something like, oh, and here's this thing that I used to decipher this, and it's something the audience didn't know about until this very moment. And it was like, when stuff like that happened, that was always so annoying. But the thing about it is, like, this isn't really... In a lot of movies like that, really, when you look at it, or stories in general, aren't necessarily about, the audience putting the pieces together before we get there. Because there's the atmosphere of it that comes with the genre itself. There's the big array of characters with all the different personalities that are memorable in themselves. And it's just the style in general is the star of a noir or a whodunit, and not necessarily the story itself. I mean, a great story that you can follow is always a plus, but it can also tend to be underwhelming when you look at how much everything else stands out just because of the way it's presented to the audience. Because there are those... I hope anybody that's ever said the phrase style over substance has been punched in the face at least once in their life. Especially back in these days, because this was the point where you hear that a lot. But the thing is, especially in cases like this, the style is the substance. Like, that's what we're here for. That's what's engrossing us, and it's almost like we feel like we're being pulled in by a story, but we're really being pulled in by the style and the characters and all that other stuff. With the plot just kind of being what's holding it all together, sometimes barely. So, because you've got stuff like there's a couple of characters in this movie that play huge parts in it that we never see. It's almost like a play, where we have Owen Taylor, whose car ends up in the water and he's dead, and we don't know what happened. That's the conversation that's going on between Hawks and Chandler when Chandler said, "I don't know what killed him. I don't know if he killed himself. I don't know if somebody threw him in there. I don't know if somebody pushed him in there. I don't know. The point is that he's dead. That's all that matters." And then you've got Sean Regan also, who gets brought up a lot. And these are characters that are just off-screen the whole time, yet they're such driving forces throughout it. And it's like stuff like that. Even when characters really stand out, when character names can stick with you, and they're characters that we never even see, they're already dead, I think that says so much about how much is really playing into what the appeal of this kind of movie is, or this kind of story is. And so, yeah, it is really confusing. It's so confounding. Every time I feel like every time I watch this movie, I end up getting frustrated at it, even though I know what to expect, and know that the style of it is what the real star of the movie is. But we keep going back to it anyway. And I think we all know the reason why. So, that on top of, like I said, especially the two of them, which, even though they have more screen time together, Bogart and Bacall, in this version rather than the version they were initially going to go with, it still feels like we could use more. They leave us wanting more, which is maybe the better way to go. Because it knows not to, run its well dry with everything, so, yeah. So, and I don't mind, honestly, getting frustrated every time I watch it, because, like I said, what's really what matters in this movie, in this story. So that's my interesting relationship I've had with The Big Sleep for quite some time now, and I feel like a lot of people probably, even people who love the movie and maybe consider it even a favorite, may feel the same way at some times. So there is that. So now when you get past those and you go to stuff like Dark Passage and Key Largo, they feel a lot more straightforward. There are intriguing stories and stuff like that. But before we go into Key Largo, let's stop at Dark Passage and kind of come to a middle ground here, where there's definitely an intriguing, if very simple, story going on here, but it's still told in a very unique way. Where the director is the very underrated Delmer Daves, and he also adapted the script. And even though he definitely has his own sort of style here in this way, in which, hardly anybody had seen a movie made in this particular style, there's so many things in Dark Passage that defied what people expected in 1947. But you also get the sense of, with it being such a suspenseful story and having such suspenseful moments, on top of the innovative techniques, it's very, very easy to compare it to Hitchcock, which I'm sure many people have. But it's really, you can definitely get that. Nobody's going to argue that. Nobody. But it still has so many things that are admirable about it. Like I said, especially with what it was doing for the time. I'm not entirely sure if there was something that predated this, but as far as what people and other filmmakers go back to in their minds, you don't really see it so much today, but there was a moment there in history where we had movies where plastic surgery used as a disguise, to disguise a criminal or a wrongly convicted criminal, was a thing for a little while. And this was kind of the definitive version of that. If there was one before this one, this is the one people think of first when they go back to that, or if they're taking inspiration from it. But then you also look at the main attraction of the movie, which is the first third or so. The first 37 minutes, I think the clock said. Where we don't see Bogart's face, because in the first moments of the movie, it's not supposed to be Bogart's face. So we see it through his perspective. and the thing, like, literally through his eyes, and we see the camera through him for the movie. It's not, like, constantly like that, like you would think, not a constant first person, but close enough to the point that it disguises, that we don't see his face unless it's in the newspaper. So when you look at it, we'd already had these two, and people said, this is what we want. We want the Bogart Bacall thing. So you bring out a new Bogart Bacall movie, and it's like, well, for starters, her co-star throughout most of these first scenes is the camera itself. Like when she's having these little banters, or when she's giving her little looks or whatever, like over the coffee table and stuff like that, it's directly to us. We are basically her co-star for the first part of it, and the only thing we hear is Bogart's voice, which that could be something that's a bit troubling in this, because it's like, his voice is so recognizable that even though we see the face in the newspaper, and it's what we have to imagine he looks like before the surgery, whenever we hear Bogart talking, it's like, he's one of those voices where you just automatically see his face when you hear his voice. And so it's almost kind of, you have to stretch as much as you can to realize that when we finally do see Bogart's face, it's like, that wasn't what it was before, but it's, yeah. But that just comes with the territory. That's the risk they had to take. And it's still, we're glad that they did. And it was seemingly so unheard of, especially then, to say, these two are what you're here for, but you're only pretty much getting one of them for a while. And even once we can tell it's Bogart and he's in the bandages, he still can't really interact. He can't speak, and we can only see, like, the top part of his head. I mean, he still does a lot with his eyes, but still, as far as what people went here for, it was, like, really risky at the time. And it's still, like, I said it was, like, 37 minutes, I think, when he's revealed with the bandages, but I think it's like, right on the hour mark when she finally cuts the bandages off. So that's like most of the movie. There's only like 45 minutes of the movie left when we get a full shot of Bogart's face, which is crazy. And a lot of people thought that it was like, and a lot of people still kind of criticize today, like it's too gimmicky, which, yeah, usually when you have a concept like this that kind of takes a risk like this or wants to try something new, in retrospect, in history, you're generally probably going to get called a gimmick and dismissed because of that. But I do think there's a lot more to it than just what it is, because the whole concept is that he doesn't have Bogart's face at the start, and that's why we don't see it. But there's also a lot that's done with it, especially in the opening scenes when he's first escaping, when it really adds to the suspense that we're seeing this from his perspective. Like, it's not just, like, you almost forget that the whole point of it is to hide what his face looks like to the audience. Because you get so wrapped up in being right through his point of view when he's in these really suspenseful situations, and that puts you into it in a whole way that we probably hadn't really seen much before back then. And there's all the confronting stuff, like when he's walking to the surgeon, and that guy, like, walks right up to him and thinks that he recognizes him, and it's like, there's something. We could watch that scene between the two, and there would be something really suspenseful about that. But the fact that we're so confronted with it, like, it's us, the audience, that's being interrogated by this guy, like, you look really familiar, and we know what the stakes are at this point, that adds a lot more suspense for the audience than just the way it was traditionally shot. So I feel like it serves that purpose just as much as it does hiding Bogart's face, or not Bogart's face. And then there's also the stuff where, like, I kind of like the sort of lonely theme about it, where there's a lot of references to that. Especially the moment when we get to the cab driver, where we get, like, the whole goldfish bowl story, and where we don't realize in the moment right away just how crucial this cab driver is going to be. And it's like, when it just kind of takes that moment to stop and kind of revel in a theme, or just a character in general when he's telling this story. And it's like, it really has nothing much to do with anything, but it's one of those things you're just glad is there, and it kind of enriches the movie in this way that you wouldn't really foresee prior to going into it. But then ultimately the way this escalates into him knowing who he is, and then him being able to help him, is just sort of ingeniously done. I love that scene in the cab. And that's another one where it's like, that character of the cab driver is so engrossing because of the way he escalates into that, where he just seems like this talkative guy. and then devolves into him knowing that. It's like you kind of, it's literally taken a back seat, the fact that they are obscuring Bogart's face, where it's like you're not even thinking about it anymore because now you're focused on this other character and the progression of where it's going to go from there. And I love the way that's done. And then and obviously just the whole aesthetic of it, like when the last thing we see through Bogart's perspective, before we come out of it, is what it looks like, so what he's seeing sort of under the anesthetic. And it's like it's basically this brief descent into hell. That really sticks out in like the middle of the movie, and it's sort of like this great transition from one act of the movie to the next, where it's like we see all the faces that he's seen and we've seen prior to this, and they're like spiraling and multiplying and all that, and it's just this really, really trippy scene. It's like, we were talking about the Hitchcock comparisons, and it's like a sort of pre-Vertigo version of that famous moment. Like this really trippy thing that just takes us in this whole other area as we're transitioning from one part of the story to the next. And then the big question comes in, once we're now looking at Bogart, even if he's covered in bandages, still, once we come out of the first-person perspective and we're seeing everything like normal now, the big question is how much of the magic that this movie has set up is left now? It's like, once the gimmick is gone, is that it? Is that all that it had? And I don't think so. I do think that it's the strongest aspect of it. It's the most engrossing part of the movie, for sure. I'm sure everybody would say that. But it still has some flourishes here and there, like the moment where he finds George dead, and when we're seemingly looking up through the floor, and the way George is laying like over the camera has always been a really interesting shot to me. And there's not much else of that after that, but still, I said there's still something here, especially as the story kind of starts to take off, and we can see that there's still a strength to that, and the way they still play with suspense, like the scene at the diner and stuff like that. And then, of course, we've got Agnes Moorehead coming in one of the most Agnes Moorehead performances ever, where she plays, it basically feels like she's playing she has two different performances in this, which is great. Because we have the moments where she's like the desperately trying to figure everything out, and then the whole, where we get her backstory of how she was the one that basically got him put away and stuff like that. And then there's the moment when he confronts her, and it's like a totally different performance, and then the way this scene escalates as far as it can escalate. There is something really great about that. And then you add another character in with Baker, I think his name is, played by Clifton Young, who basically, once again, he's a character at the very beginning that we think is probably never going to be important again, and then he ends up being like almost a full antagonist by the time we get to the end and bring him back around. And he's got that creepy smile about him. Like there's something very Richard Woodmark about his smile in these scenes in the later moments. That's really great. But I suppose if there's a couple of things that bring it down a little bit, because when I first saw Dark Passage, I didn't really think much of it. Like, I was kind of one of those people that was like, oh, the gimmick's nice, but then everything after doesn't quite have that magic. But the more I see it, the more I get into these later parts of it. The only issue is that, obviously, there's a lot of conveniences. It's very reliant on conveniences, particularly one that especially stands out that I still like because they still kind of play with the memorable character sort of thing, is the moment after the diner, and he tries to run away, and the chase is broken up because that guy almost hits them with his car. And like that feels like a massive convenience because it's a character we've never seen before. But the way this guy says, at least I don't think we've seen him before. It's been a little while since I watched it like all the way through. But he's talking about how he's a night watchman, and he's like being really aggressive in how they ran out in front of him. But then when the guy says that he's a cop, like he's saying the same dialogue, like I'm a night watchman, but he changes his demeanor so much. And there's also, though, I feel like it's got a major pacing problem, which, like, it feels a lot longer than it is, and each segment feels a lot longer than it is, which is weird because it's pretty much perfectly broken up through the 3-act structure, because you've got the moment where we've got the first-person perspective, which you could say is Act 1, the moment where he's covered in the bandages, which you could say is Act 2, and then Act 3 when they're off. It's like there's a perfect... the story sets up the perfect 3-act structure here. But there's just something about the pacing that's always been off to me. So it's got that going against it, but for the most part, I do love it the more I revisit it, and I can appreciate all the different aspects of it, and the way they take that, and the way they kind of toy with suspense in different ways. And like I said, bringing the character of Baker back around, like I said, it can be a bit convoluted for sure, but still, just the way, as long as you embrace it, there's still definitely something there worthwhile. It's also worth noting that Tales from the Crypt kind of took a little bit of this aspect when I think it was Zemeckis directed an episode of Tales from the Crypt where the whole thing was through a character's first-person perspective, and they used archive footage, and it's like whenever the character looked in a mirror or talked or something, it was Bogart. Long after death, to the point that Bogart has like the top billing in that episode, and it's really trippy, but also a really great callback to Dark Passage. So there's that. So finally, going into Key Largo, after everything we've talked about, Key Largo feels so straightforward, but that's definitely not a bad thing at all. Like, especially a story like this, like a crime story where there's like a hostage situation, and there's a clear good guy and a clear bad guy. Simplicity's really the best way to go, and you can get some really good stuff out of that as long as you have like strong character work going on, and you've got great suspenseful scenes and stuff like that. One thing I forgot to mention that I wanted to was something that Howard Hawks always said, especially regarding The Big Sleep, was I think it's a great movie. It's a movie that has 3 great scenes and no bad ones, at the minimum. And you could probably say that about just about everything we're talking about here. And stuff in Hawks' filmography especially. You can tell he really took that sort of statement to heart. So this one is also an extremely recognizable director, though, in John Huston. And this was right after he and Bogart reuniting just the year after The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And when you look at all 4 of these movies and how beloved they are and their places in movie history and stuff like that, it might seem a little odd that of all 4 of these movies combined, only 1 Oscar nomination happened. But it was one that it won, with Claire Trevor winning Best Supporting Actress for Key Largo. But before we get into her, there is I guess you could say Key Largo is the least involved in the romance between the two. Like, doesn't have near, like, the fire and the power and the dialogue and stuff like that, that these others do, because this one is so pretty much driven by its plot, more or less, much more than the other 3. But really, the relationship that stands out in the first portion of this movie is the relationship between Bogart and Lionel Barrymore. And it's who's playing her father, and it's between the two of them where Bogart has basically come back after the war, and Lionel Barrymore's son has been killed over there, and they were like, they were really close over there, and so the way they're like recalling memories of him together, and Bogart saying like, oh, he used to always say this thing about the top of your lip, and Barrymore says like, oh my god, I remember telling him that, and it's like, these are really great moments before anything has happened, and it's like, that's the most as far as we get, I think, as far as it not being totally and completely straightforward, is it is at least a slow burn, which is also great because you've got all this stuff going on, like, surrounding it, where you've got this impending hurricane that's coming, and, like, the more we get closer to that, the more we can sense that danger is looming. But there's also these dudes hanging around, like Thomas Gomez and all the other guys, and it's building to something, but if you're going into the movie for the first time and you don't know what the plot is, the great thing about this is you can sense it building to something, but you don't necessarily realize it's building up another character with the Edward G. Robinson character, where it's like, when you see these guys around and the way they're acting and the way they're acting like they own the place and stuff like that, you get this sense that there is a higher power somewhere. Like when you see these guys, you get this sense of, I don't think this is it. I feel like these guys are under something more powerful than them. and then sure enough, the Edward G. Robinson character is introduced, Johnny Rocco. But going in with the setting, also, the Florida setting, it is one of those cases of, and it's to my understanding it was shot, like, on location, because you would think with movies like this, that you tend to imagine, like, a lot of sets, and a lot of fakery going on. But to my understanding, it actually was shot on location, and you get that sense where, even if it is, like, even with the way it's set up, sometimes it does still feel like a set. But you can almost, like, even being in black and white, because as far as locations go, there is a way where, like, you can almost get a sense of a location through the screen. But the thing about that is usually color is involved in this, and the fact that this is a black and white movie, but still you can somehow watch these scenes when they're, like, getting out on the boat, and it's like you can especially in the early scenes before anything's taken off, it's like you can smell the salt water. And it's like I said, even in, like, with black and white imagery, somehow, like, the feel of Florida still comes through. I don't know, it may help to have, like, been there, because I haven't been there in a while, but in my youth we would go to Florida annually. And, like, I just kind of get the sense of those familiar smells when I see those early scenes in Key Largo, and they're still there even despite that. And there's also these great touches, like the use of mirrors kind of early on. There's a couple that stand out where, like, the opening shot of Bogart, the reveal of Bogart in the movie, one of the first shots, is the reflection of his face perfectly in the side mirror of the bus after it stops at the beginning, which is a really great shot and a really great way to introduce the character. And then there's also this great moment when I think it's Bogart and Thomas Gomez that are in the scene, and the camera turns and it's them talking, and only we're watching them in the mirror, and then Bogart says, like, Bogart starts to leave the room, only instead of, like, the camera turning and following Bogart out, it zooms into the mirror and follows him out that way, which I always thought was interesting. Like I said, doesn't necessarily say much of anything, but it brings the scene to life in a way that really works. And then there's also some stuff that works, and may sometimes simultaneously not work. There's one particular moment where it may be the worst moment of Bacall. It might have been one of the worst moments of Bacall's career, to be honest. Which, and I do know that they were, between Down and Not in the Big Sleep, they were kind of weary of putting her in the Big Sleep because she had just done a movie, I can't remember the name of it now, but she had just done a movie with Charles Boyer where she got really bad reviews. But even despite that, there was this moment in Key Largo that, and I think it's worse because it punctuates such a strong moment, especially with the reality that's in it. The fact that Lionel Barrymore was actually confined to a wheelchair because of arthritis. So to have this moment where he stands up and tries to take a swing at Edward G. Robinson and ends up hitting the ground instead, it's like this really big moment. And it's like really kind of tragic moment for the character too, because you just see, like, this is supposed to be a moment to, like, really, literally stand up against this guy, and to just literally hit the floor. It's just so dehumanizing, and it's tragic. But it is immediately followed up by this moment of Bacall running up to him and trying to hit him, and she, like, lightly is drumming on his chest. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know if there was another take of that they could have used. But it unfortunately looks terrible, and it punctuates this really big moment. So I try to forget that moment exists, but apart from that, we do have the Oscar winner in this, the Claire Trevor performance. And she's one of those characters where as soon as you meet her, in the first few seconds you meet her, she's big and she's loud and she's obnoxious, and you're like, oh, it's going to be one of those Oscar-winning performances, okay. But then as it goes on, there are more, like, smaller moments or more tender moments, like when she goes to comfort Bacall, and that one moment is really nice. But then there's also moments where you realize, and you hear, like, the behind-the-scenes stories that really help this also. The scene where she has to sing was apparently put on her, like apparently she knew she was going to have to sing, but she was never told when until, like, in the moment. When it's like, okay, this is the part where you sing, by the way. And apparently what Houston wanted was, because she was, I guess, not an experienced singer, so Houston thought it would be more, like, because her character is supposed to be, like, really off balance and nervous and just frazzled by everything that's happening, to just thrust her right into it and say, okay, you're doing this now, and then that's basically what we see on the screen, like, and like really enhance that performance in a way. So credit to both of them for being able to pull that scene off. And then, of course, we do have these scenes that we're just kind of almost abruptly thrust into, but the abruptness is what makes them so powerful. It's the moment when they have their guns on each other, Bogart and Robinson, and it's like he basically gives him a gun and invites him to, partake in this shootout. And then it's the whole thing about, the great thing about the Bogart character in this is, because this scene happens so early, and because even though it is suspenseful in the moment, we kind of get a sense of where it's going to go, because the shootout's not going to happen this early. And how the war has basically made him not want to immediately, jump into this. So the big question throughout the whole movie is, when will Bogart's character act eventually? And that's kind of a big sort of thing that plays out through his character and makes him so intriguing throughout, is we're just kind of waiting for that moment as we build and build, and Robinson gets more and more sort of under his skin and everybody else's skin also. And then eventually we have this moment. We do have the transition moment where the movie kind of settles down after the hurricane has passed and all the suspenseful scenes have happened. The cop ends up getting killed. Where that guy Ziggy they're supposed to meet comes and they do their thing, and then it's time to go, and then we're going to get our climax. Which is this really sort of great standoff moment, especially when it gets down to just the two of them. And Robinson's not sure exactly where he is, but Bogart knows where he is, and they're just sort of waiting to converge in the same spot so that Bogart can finally take his shot. And it's to my understanding that not only is that a great climax in itself, but it was going to be the climax of To Have and Have Not. Like, it's the climax of Hemingway's novel, and Hawks basically said, oh, here, Houston, why don't you take this, because I didn't need it. I didn't have to use it, so... Because we deviated that much, and then it's like, but we can't let this scene go to waste, and it just kind of perfectly, almost eerily perfectly lined up to being the climax of Key Largo and working in that way. So, yeah, I think that's about all that can be said about these four, at least from me. And there's, like I said, when you look at The Big Sleep and To Have and Have Not, there are, like, essays upon essays out there of it that can go into all the different meanings and all the different other stuff that we didn't touch on, but this is just kind of how I feel about them generally. So, yeah, and I don't know, I was originally going to do like a ranking of them, but I don't know if you can, I don't know. Because like I said, Down I'm Not in The Big Sleep just kind of feel like one entity themselves, like combined. And I said Key Largo feels like such a straightforward, suspense movie by itself, and Dark Passage is doing all this innovative stuff. It's hard to say. The one that I like to revisit the most is probably Dark Passage. So, and I know that's sacrilege because Down I'm Not and The Big Sleep are like considered like the ultimate classics, but it's also, I think also Key Largo and Dark Passage just kind of in general touch on the genres that appeal to me more, where it's like, the crime genre, the suspense genre, stuff like that, the Hitchcockian sort of way. So that's basically how I feel about those in a nutshell. So the next thing is, I think, just going to be another traditional versus, and then more Stephen King stuff, and a review video at some point. That Hugh Jackman movie for HBO will probably show up some point. Then we'll go from there. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for this.